Hey readers, um, based on some interest from some people on Discord, I decided to make a little bookshelf video. But before I do that, I'm going to start with what hasn't quite made its way to the bookshelf yet, and that is yesterday's mail. First thing I got was The Blaze of Noon by Rainer Happenstall. He's an experimental writer from England in the sort of 40s, 50s. And the premise here is that the character is blind, and that was sort of like a constraint that Rainer found interesting, to write a book with no visual description, and instead at least the first part has very sort of detailed description of his other senses, and sort of how he deduces certain aspects about people based on those senses. It seems objectively wrong, some of these inferences, but it sounds interesting. I found it in there's a book that was talking about English experimental writers, so I ordered a couple. Don't know too much about Verissimo. I read the description of it and sort of sounded both funny and interesting, and any author who truly loves Borges I have some affinity with. I also have the Tell Borges If You See Him. I haven't read it, but I just couldn't resist it because I'm a big fan. Shanghai Dancing by Brian Castro. I recently read Bathhouse Fugues by him, which was very good. He has sort of literary interests that makes reading the non-essential non-plot stuff he's talking about is always interesting, and he writes in very good prose, and this seems coincidentally gotten a lot of books that has a fair amount of illustrations and drawings lately, without particularly aiming for it, but it is interesting. Sisters of the Cross is so apparently this Alexei Remezov was like sort of one of those very good Russian modernists. He's mentioned in the same breath as Belu, which might not quite be that good, because a few people are, but this particular book took very long to be translated. It was supposedly very challenging, and they was talking about how English in particular was a language that this wouldn't get it wasn't translated in, because apparently the sort of the language he uses is like a very tricky mix of sort of high literary, old-fashioned, and sort of maybe more colloquial uh, sort of I don't know, maybe like the dialects of country folk. But yeah, I haven't read anything else by him, so this will be interesting. Yeah, to the next pile. Never been particularly interested in Adam Levine, but I've been enjoying the YouTube channel of We Damage We recently, and he speaks very highly of him, and I figured I'd start with this one just because it was cheap and easy to get a hold of compared to his more famous work. And then lastly, I received 2 books by Philip Toynbee. Well, this last one is he has a sort of a collection of journals. The second one is called Part of a Journey. End of a Journey is the last one, and I do believe I wouldn't be surprised if the first one is called Start of a Journey. Would make sense. And I got his The Garden to the Sea. I recently read Tea with Mrs. Goodman, which is sort of his most famous book, and it had like 4 ratings on Goodreads. So he's not very well known, but he was also one of those British experimental writers from the 40s and onwards. And the Tea with Mrs. Goodman was quite interesting. Sort of the main story takes place over 12 pages, and then that story, it's just a tea party, and the events of that tea party is retold with sort of the inner thoughts of the different characters one by one. So you sort of get little details and little insights into how these people think about each other, and it's sort of what really happened during that tea party is sort of a mystery that you sort of figure out as you read through it. A journal seems quite interesting. I really want to get at least the first one the most. I think the first one has a lot of his sort of early days education and sort of the writers he read and influenced him. The second one is sort of like his spiritual crisis, trying to find a religion. I'm sure he was born into a religion, but sort of had like the spiritual crisis. And this last one is more about aging and the relationship with his wife, and but from the little bits I've sampled, it's quite nice. Sort of one of those books you could just pick up and read a short little paragraph and be satisfied and put it away again. Okay, on to the bookshelf. We have some interesting books here. There's Garden Next Door by Jose Donoso. Very big fan of his The Obscene Bird of Night. Goethe Solo I like. Aikman is nice. This copy of The Painter Gabriel is by Donald Newlove, which was one of the Tough Poet Press published writers. I thought that the Jungian tale of the werewolves and finance was surprisingly good, because it sounds not like my typical cup of tea, but it was actually very good. Yeah, everyone knows Schmidt, of course. Questioning Minds is quite interesting. It was a birthday present 2 years ago. The letters between Hugh Kenner and Guy Davenport. Guy Davenport is a very interesting writer. He writes. He can sort of write a convincing story. You'd think it was written by a Greek, an ancient Greek. It's quite interesting how well read and erudite he is. Some Gaddis, Broadkey. If you're interested in Broadkey, you should watch Paperbird's videos on him. The Tunnel, probably one of my favorite novels. I was starting out a sort of an Gaddis flex shelf, but I sort of abandoned it because the authors got so spread out, having like one book by McElroy and then 2 more down. And as it is right now is not optimal, so I just gave up on that. There's some interesting books here too. Larva by Rios, I've only sampled. It's difficult. Monstrary I've read, which is was quite good. I'm excited about Novel Explosives from Leaf by Leaf's channel. Spoke very highly of that. We're quite lucky in Norway to have all of Orbitor translated. The Blinding, quite lovely covers too. I've only read the first one. I've read it in English, but I've sampled a Norwegian one, and it seems like it's still eminently readable and not bad prose even in Norwegian. I prefer the English though, so it would be nice to see more Carterescu translated. More Gaddis, more Gas. Puig is interesting. Kiss of the Spider Woman. Sort of. It's about two prisoners, and one of the things they do to entertain, well, one does to entertain the other, is to tell him about movies that he hasn't watched, and so you get sort of these little short stories that are movies, and it's interestingly done, and it's quite entertaining, quite good. Lundolfi is of course my Discord avatar, from those who know me from Discord. Big fan of him. The Levendara should also be familiar to most of you. The Julian Garak, lovely prose writer. Next to Nabokov, fittingly enough. We have a bit too much Richard Powers, I think. Goldbug Variations and Galatea 2.2 were both great. Orfeo was very good. The Overstory sort of didn't quite work for me. It had some nice parts, but yeah, not as good as his others. Well, that's probably not what you'll hear from the literary journalists. I think that idealism sells in this day and age. and it's great, but as a book, I didn't love it. Little collection of Barth, big fan of Barth. Some more McElroy. Here we have some Volman that I haven't gotten around to yet, but people I respect do like them a lot, so I have bought some Bolaño. I feel like Bolaño is a bit of a mixed bag. Savage Detectives is very good. Some of his other stuff not so much. I haven't read 2666 yet, so I have hopes for that. Margaret Djursnar, very good. Patricia Eakins. I've sampled it, and that sounds interesting. I'm excited for that one. There's the aforementioned Donald Newlove, quite good. Wittgenstein's Mistress was lovely. One of those perfect novels, in my opinion. Read it a few times. Auto da Fe, upside down here. Very, very nice. I had a paperback copy of that fell apart. I'm glad to have replaced that. Red Doc, Anne Carson is excellent. Red Doc was not as good as the autobiography of Red, but still very good. I like her a lot. Coleman Dowell was an interesting book. Cheever stories, never bad. Milhauser, I don't know. I had one of my first literary loves was Borges, so I was very fond of short stories for a while. And Milhauser has some quite good ones, but he's a bit too conventional in his writing, I feel. Some Goyen. House of Breath is excellent. Haven't read his others yet. First of many John Hawkes, we will see. Second Bitau, been recommended to me by a good friend. Excited to read that. Here we have Steinar Løding, which is probably the most interesting Norwegian literature I've read. Iron Age Dream, which you might have seen on the untranslated blog. And another, I wish was translated, but so it's sort of a bit of a cult book in Norway. The author, Svein Jarvoll, he was, or I guess he's been a professional translator of Greek, and he sort of shines through in the book. Lots of references, lots of quotes from the ancient Greek texts. It's quite nice. You get quite a bit of it in this guy too. Tor Ulven, I think, is probably the best Norwegian prose writer that I've ever come across, at least. And yeah, he the one book that is translated of this into English is called The Replacements, which is very good. You definitely see what he's capable of doing with prose, but it's not as good as some of his other stuff, in my opinion. And this book is his collected prose. He has a book of collected poetry as well that I want to get, even though, as you shall see on these shelves, there's not that much poetry here. And it's not an accident. I have a little Malcolm Lowry section. Currently in a long reading group of his books. Under the Volcano is, of course, a wonderful, wonderful book. And I've read that a couple of times. I recently read the Day biography, and it really made me enjoy what I remember from Under the Volcano even more. I'm going to have a third reread of that soon, and I'm excited for that. Italo Calvino, a big fan of, that follows from my early Borges days and the short story fascination. I'm not quite sure where my copy of If on a Winter's Night a Traveler is, but that and Cosmic Comics are by far my favorite works of his. Going here on to a little bit of Shakespeare in my Library of America books. Well, most of them. I think I have one Nabokov and one Le Guin not featured in this shelf. Lullaby for a Hanged Man by Klimko. Yeah. I'm not going to pronounce that. But this is an excellent, very short read. It's sort of a Polish poet, writer that lived quite a lot of years in Iceland, and with his, he had two friends that his friends struggled with mental illness, and like one of the things he would tell you early on in the book is that he would pick them up at the asylum and drive to Reykjavik's IKEA, because that's where they had the cheapest hot dogs, and they would feast on hot dogs, and he would take them back, and they were released and they lived together, and he sort of tells some anecdotes, but then one of his friends, who was struggling with depression and sort of disassociating and being hard to reach sometimes, he ended up killing himself. And this whole book is sort of like a goodbye, a little, way of remembering. And it's got great stories. It's very heartwarming and quite good. Some Everyman's Library. Still have my Joseph and His Brothers wrapped in plastic. Very much looking forward to it though, because I think Magic Mountain is excellent. Also one of my favorite books. We have Ulysses. I have a paperback of that book as well in my bedroom. Stones of Summer is excellent. It's interesting. I heard about it at some point and I ordered it, and it got lost in the mail. And then a year and a month later, it showed up, and I did some research, and there's this whole documentary about this book. And when you read people review it, it seems like a lot of people just loved the documentary and never really read the book, or the ones who did, they sort of didn't get it. But it is sort of the entire life of this one kid, and you sort of see some traces early on that he's a little off. He's got like this very poetic way of describing the world, and some sort of very different thought patterns that get progressively worse with age, and it just descends into like the most wonderful ending. But yeah, I think it's great. It's probably not for everyone. Oops. Couple of tiny books by Rick Hirsch's press. Jeff Bursey, I like. I read his verbatim. Very funny, very interesting. I haven't gotten around to this. And he also published short story collection recently. But back to this shelf. Death and Equality was good. The Lucinda Ebersole, she sadly lost her battle with cancer many years before I discovered her. But I ordered this book cheaply on Better World Books, and luckily enough, it was a signed copy. But it's sort of like it's about an author who discovers she has cancer and wants to go to the sort of the small town which she grew up in, and you sort of see the perspectives of, you know, a very, very poor town. And she sort of is very interestingly written, because I think Stephen Moore said that she does this brilliant thing of, you know, if and when sort of people have stretched the Southern Gothic to the limits of what it can do, and the postmodern to what it could do, she sort of brilliantly combines them. And it's sort of, what happens is that the character is sort of fading in and out of consciousness with all the drugs and everything that is diminishing her pain at the end of her life. And you sort of has like this dreamlike flow between waking and dreaming, and you get these stories from her youth, and yeah, it's quite good. I'm excited about Trieste. I feel like Dasa sounds like a very interesting writer. Really want to get her EEG as well. A friend of mine speaks very warmly of her. Orchid Stories by Elmsley. It's quite interesting. Skipping a lot that, you know, most people probably heard of, like not a big fan of Tanizaki, but I have, it's a great cover at least, but I have a few Tanizaki spread around. This is a very interesting book. This is a Swedish writer who retells sort of Odysseus's travels, but set in like World War I. And not quite sure if it's structured on the Iliad or the Odyssey, but my initial thought was it was the Iliad, but from the back it does sound kind of like the Odyssey. This, you see the pages aren't even cut open, so I feel quite lucky with getting this copy. It was very hard to find any copies of it all, even harder in Swedish. Pavuch is interesting. The Dictionary of the Khazars is, you know, Borgesian, I suppose. Very fun. haven't read Landscape Painted with Tea yet, but I ordered it very quickly after reading the Khazars because I liked his style very much. The Demons. It's one of those you've all heard a lot of talk about recently, or not recently, but the last few years, I would guess, because I have. We have a little collection of my Borges hardbacks. I have some paperbacks as well somewhere. Would like to complete it, but I feel like I have the most important stuff. Labyrinths was my first. Big fan of that. Time for a big Borges reread now. It's been a very long time. The new Bras Cubas translations and stories of the Assis. These Tartarus Press books are very nice. You can just feel the binding and the quality of the pages and everything is just very nice. And this is one of the limited edition signed copies. Quite nice. Recently got this second one too, and this I got really cheap. As you can see, it's a library discard, but it's also one of those limited edition signed copies, and quite the signature. But yeah, these are like really quite weird Welsh stories. But very interesting. I like one of the things I like with literature is being able to think in ways that I wouldn't be able to on my own, and that's why I do like some books that are strange and eccentric. Hans Henny Jan. I've read most of this book in Norwegian. Read parts of it in German. It's slow going, and it's just sort of something I'll just open and read a little bit in whenever I feel like it. But Jan is very good. I'm a big fan of Nicholas Mosley. Catastrophe Practice is strange. Like, calling it a novel is a stretch nearly. It's it has a lot of it's sort of written as a very strange play, and the characters in it seem to sometimes think that they're actors in a play, and sometimes they'll forget it, and be a little nervous, wondering why they're on stage and such. And the characters are apparently characters from the following books in the series. Imago Bird was much more readable and quite good. Serpent and Judith I need to read, and then the big payoff, of course, is Hopeful Monsters, which is like the end of that series, which is supposedly very good. But what I've read and truly loved is The Possible Object. I feel that this is, for me, it's a perfect novel. It has it has beautiful prose. It's it's sort of structured like an impossible object. An impossible object is, of course, also a reference to love, which is the impossible object that always, all the stories feature love in some way. And but yeah, I don't want to spoil what makes the structure so brilliant, but the different novellas, short stories in it, do intertwine in interesting ways. So we read it 3 times and made a bunch of people, forced them to read it. Just read 3 Wogs, which was okay. It showed some promise of the later Theroux. If I'd not read Darkenwill's Cat first, I probably would have enjoyed it more. The subject matter is a bit dated. It's a bit hard to parse in these woke times, but yeah, now if you haven't read Darkenville's Cat, like, this is the book. He has such an interesting use of language. Like, he will find these obscure words and they'll be perfect in the sentence. Like, it's very impressive what he does. I have some Stephen Moore, including the book on Theroux. It's very interesting. Like, you don't need the internet to find good books. If you just read the novel in alternate history and maybe also his back pages, will be all you need to discover hundreds of excellent books. Some interesting ones on this shelf too. This isn't the original Flatland, of course, which I haven't read, but also sounds very interesting. But it is a very striking book. It writes about it has a very, at times, very scientific writing, which I appreciate. I think something that I'm familiar with and like. Also lots of beautiful illustrations. So, very curious about that. I recently got it. Pancake is interesting. Compose is wonderful. The Fear of Losing Eurydice. It's probably one of the best books I read this year. Discovered a lot of very good women writers through my back pages by Stephen Moore. And that's one of them. Another is Mary Caponegro. Heard Mark Nash's praise of this. It was a recent arrival. But yeah, it sounds quite interesting. Here we have some collection of letters: William James and Henry James, Talcovino, Nabokov. And here we have a little section of books about books. The Anatomy of Bibliomania is very, very funny. Derrida has a couple of books there that just sort of talks about good books and why you should read them, and why the classics are classics. Library at Night by Manguel is very, very compelling. The Loop, I'll talk more about later, but I do love Jacques Roubaud. Knausgård, love me some Oscar Wilde. Louis Selly, I did not love. Latest Knausgård. The Morning Star. Apparently it's nearly a sci-fi. My mom read it. More John Hawkes. Some more Jacques Roubaud. Oh, Byron. Oh, got lost. This oversized book by Norma Casserer. It's quite interesting. Very few of it printed, and I feel like especially this first story is really quite excellent. It has a lot of these quite interesting illustrations. But yeah, it's a curiosity. Found a copy on the Spanish Amazon and ordered it. I want to briefly just mention Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, because it's not a book I would dare to read now, because as readers we do change. Our preferences change. Exposure to better and better writing teaches us to better appreciate writing. So I'm afraid if I read this I would not like it very much. But this was like a book I read when I was 13 on a old broken CRT monitor. I read the two first books at least. Then I went to London with my dad and he bought me this collection, and skip forwards another 5 years, and I skipped class in high school and went with my friends to Oslo to meet the man, the legend, and get it signed. It was when he was launching his PC multimedia sort of game thing, and so yeah, it has some sentimental value. Woodhouse, do enjoy some Jeeves, and yeah. Syncuthi is interesting. I haven't read Prey. Well, I've sampled it, but Marginalia on Casanova was very good. Exquisite Corpse. It's okay. The Memory of Fire trilogy is quite interesting. I only read the first book, but when I finished it, I did run off and order the two next ones. Sort of like a quick recapitulation of Western history from the sort of Southern American perspective, and sort of it starts out with like their mythology and moves on to Christopher Columbus and sort of all of the horrible things that were done, but it goes on all the way to modern times, and it's quite interesting. Some Cormac McCarthy, which we all know is one of my favorites. Some D. Keith Mano he's glossed over his Take 5, which is of course his famous one. Promise Keeper, it's very interesting. I don't think I remember to mention In Partial Disgrace on my first shelf, but that's a very good book. The Promise Keeper I haven't read yet, but it has the subtitle Tephromancy, which is a neat subtitle. Read parts of this, very interesting, but I was reading other times, so it was put away. I was reading other things rather. Here we have a shelf that is nearly organized because it was part of a big summer reading group a couple of years ago, and Magnetic Fields, very much recommend. Dapper young lad. Love this book. It's very funny, but a Finnish statistician living in Buenos Aires. Very funny, very like his mental life completely collapses, and it's very well written. I'm very excited. I'm very happy I have Katerva as well. Tom Mullen is very interesting. Knut is the book we read. Do you believe I've managed to collect everything by Mullen? There's up 90 in the back. It's also an interesting painter, apparently. His son has been selling off his paintings. I'm glad to have a signed copy of his book, at least. Oh, yes. William S. Wilson is an excellent writer. Let's see. Why I Don't Write Like Franz Kafka is very good short stories. But this is an interesting book. And it's told in it's a post-apocalyptic epistolary novel where sort of the financial system has broken down, and letters and stamps seem to be like a currency, and you owe everyone you love a letter. it's quite a wonderful world he describes, and yeah, it's big fan of that. Bruno Schultz, big fan of his. He sort of has like both these crazy madman stories, but also sort of like lovely, lush, thick prose that, some might not be drawn to. But I think it's lovely. I think he's quite interesting. Mangled Hands is wonderful. I really hope as many of you as possible helped fund Tough Poets Press's re-release of this. This is, of course, the Sun and Moon original. It's very strange. Like it has like there are like sort of Huron myths and encounters with Jesuits as sort of like a loose basis for this, but there is suddenly an animal will come up and join with your chest and be a part of you, and your genitals will pop off and leave you, and people will smoke tobacco to receive visions. And I don't know, it's like you read it, you just have to read it and take everything it says seriously, and it's a wonderful thing that will play out in your mind. Giorgio Manganelli, very good. This isn't my favorite of his. These 100 Urborg novels, sort of kind of similar to Borges in a way, where Borges felt like you could write what was essential about a story you could tell in a short story. In this one, he goes even further, and most of these novels are just like one page or maybe two. Jens Bjørneboe is another excellent Norwegian writer. I've started to appreciate more in my autumnal years. This is thematic trilogy about the problem of evil. It's called The History of Bestiality. He's also very famous for a book on sort of neglect and abuse and school system and such. And I read it, and it was okay, but I was too young when I read it, so I was in school myself, so I probably didn't have the empathy to quite get the full meaning of it. But these books are excellent. I recently reread the first one, and I'm gonna do a reread of the two next ones soon. But they're very, very much. You see a lot of the lived life of the author in it. He struggled with alcoholism. At one point, he drank a bottle of whiskey every day. And you see in his characters that alcoholism is a big part of it, and you see some of his professions also be sort of retold in these stories. The Great Fire of London was very interesting. Jacques Roubaud was a professional mathematician who also wrote some poetry and some novels. So he can be interesting to understand. And what's interesting about this book also is that see these references to paragraphs and such. The book sort of bifurcates, and there are several ways of reading it. But I think that it can be read a straightforward fashion and not lose too much about it. But the way certain parts of your life can be cyclical and you return to things and passions can be interesting to be read like that too. It's a lot about his love for his wife, who died very young, and sort of something he processed and wrote about for his entire life. But it's a very good book. Also talks a lot about his life as a walker and a swimmer, and sort of the joys of walking through a new city and an old city, and just mile after mile, and stopping at a bookstore and a cafe, and just sort of those things that people who love books love to do. Jonathan Bayliss is very forgotten. I've had these for a while now, and I'd kind of hoped to get around to reading them before the rest of the world discovered them, because I don't know if they're good yet. But recently there was a thread on Goodreads in the Buried Authors Club where they were talking about him. I literally found it by Googling for postmodern novels. Then I found a Bayliss Society, and yeah, it seems interesting. I've been really struggling to find the book between Prologos and Gloucester Moss. There's a Gloucester book in between, and every time I've ordered it recently, I've received a copy of The Guide to Gloucester, which is, I'm sure will be somewhat interesting in reading Bayliss, but not really what I'm looking for. Get this in focus. Perrick, of course, very good. More hawks. Curious about Pascal Quinar. Beautiful books. Not quite sure about him yet, though. I haven't tried him, but he sounds interesting. Interesting, but his characters are somewhat awful, so it's kind of hard to really get into it, but he's technically a very good author, and I want to read some more by him. It's a fun one, of course, for those not familiar with the Aleppo. Here is sort of one short story that's rewritten in different styles. It's sort of very fun for people who are interested in formal aspects. Some Krishna Horkai. Satan Tango is very good. Yeah, Life, very good. Death by Water. And The Changeling, actually, I think I liked maybe better, even. Owa is one of the few Japanese authors that I quite like. Oh yeah, and I said last time we saw The Loop, because I have 2 copies. I mentioned I would talk some more about him, and The Loop is the second book in the trilogy that started with The Great Fire of London. And then the last book is yes, is mathematics. And very excited to read those because, like I said, they're quite good. Oh, I forgot to mention Degrees by Michel Butor. Very good book, very interesting writing. It's about a teacher who decides to chronicle everything, what his students are doing, and he's starting to describe things in more detail until he needs to have students sort of spy and report back to him because he can't see and observe everything. But it's very well written, and it's a very interesting writer. Curious about this one. Another Argentine writer. And he compares him to Lampedusa, who I like quite a lot. So I'm quite curious about this as well. Pretty book, if nothing else. Has some nice illustrations. But yeah. Has some Lispector, which have not really gotten to yet. Coming full circle to Russian modernists. The Petty Demon is excellent. Some more Donoso. Du Cornet, I've only read the Fanmaker's Inquisition, and I wasn't blown away by it. But people keep talking about how good she is, so I will read some more Du Cornet. Periodic Table, very good. Couple of Norwegian writers in there, and a book about when the postmodernism came to Norway. Professor in the Siren, very nice. Old Airs by Manganelli, very, very lovely. To Those Gods Beyond I haven't read yet, but Old Airs I think is the favorite of the Manganelli I've read so far. The Evenings by Gerard Rev, very funny book. Some more Lobo's Autunist. Last shelf of the ones that I'm going to show, at least. Thomas Jönsson, bestseller. Hilarious, very good book. Sokolov is excellent. School for Fools is truly one of the best books. So there's a whole pile of Raymond Fetterman. It's French, of course. Wouldn't go that sharp on my pronunciation. Anything Can Happen is an interesting one. There's lots of interesting conversations between authors like John Hawkes and Barth and many others. It's quite nice. I have some Walter Kilpie. We have some poetry and plays. Changing Light at Sandover. I've read a collection of Merrill's poetry that's a bit thicker than this, which is okay. Big fan of The Infernal Machine by Cocteau. Also his movies about Orpheus. Baudelaire I love. He's one of the few where I can truly disregard the rhyming and still enjoy very much what's going on there. Onetti, I'm curious about some Oneric short stories. Dunan, Walter Abish. It was kind of interesting. I'll read some more Abish at some point. Maybe Alphabetical Africa. Vaughanville, I've only really read The Sea, but that was very good. Jacques Roubaud and Perec on Go. Very cool. Nostalgia by Cartarescu. Here we have haven't really read this corner of the literary internet yet, but Ricard is of course an interesting guy with his own YouTube where he reviews a lot of the books that his press puts out. This you may have watched a video on this on Noah's channel. Everyone who reads it must converse. And this whole novel was sort of written as a response to Rick Hirsch. And Hirsch, he shows up as sort of like a mysterious transmitter of messages in this novel. So not quite sure about it yet, but of course our friend Leaf by Leaf spoke very warmly of it, so should be interesting. Yeah, complete fiction of W.M. Spackman is interesting. Like, what he writes about isn't so interesting. Sort of upper middle class life, well educated people and their sort of marital problems and the likes. But the way he writes is quite good. I read An Armful of Warm Girl, which made me order this, and yeah, big fan of his writing, at least. Notes without a text was interesting. Oh yeah, no, didn't like that so much. Infinity of Lists is quite interesting. Umberto Eco was sort of given free rein to hold a series of lectures at a museum, and this was sort of like the culmination of it. Also exists as an oversized hardback, which I sadly do not own, but quite happy with that. More Brian Costro. Look forward to reading that. Yeah. The Scylla trilogy, didn't care much for that. Not sure if it'll catch. Yeah, it's kind of pretty. It's got like this raised back. The Philip Toynbee I just read. It's very good. Batoki, very fun. Sort of, it's like, I don't know, like the Decameron or Southern in One Night. It's sort of like more and more people show up, and everyone tells a story, and sometimes they tell a story about someone showing up and telling a story. So it's like a very nested, convoluted story, but it is quite good, very fun. And yeah, there we are. Thanks for watching.